Let's get started. Story number 1.
The air was damp with an unnatural chill, and the small New England town of Blackwater seemed to breathe in shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. Hannah Graham pulled her coat tighter as she stepped off the bus, her suitcase thumping against the cracked asphalt. She glanced at the note in her hand, the looping script barely legible. "Welcome to the old Harwick Manor. We hope you find your new home comfortable. Keys under the mat. Jackson Realty." The Harwick Manor stood on the edge of town, an imposing structure of dark stone and ivy. Locals had called it cursed for decades, citing disappearances, tragic accidents, and whispers of restless spirits. But Hannah, a struggling artist desperate for solitude and cheap rent, dismissed the rumors. Ghosts weren't real, just the stuff of overactive imaginations. She found the key beneath the mat as promised. As she pushed open the heavy oak door, a musty smell greeted her, tinged with something metallic. The grand entryway was dim, illuminated only by her phone's flashlight. Dust coated the floor, and cobwebs hung like tattered lace from the chandeliers. Yet, despite its decay, the house exuded an undeniable charm, as if holding its breath for a new chapter. Hannah moved in with ease. By midnight, she had unpacked her essentials and fallen asleep in a worn but surprisingly sturdy bed she found in the master bedroom. The first night was uneventful, silent, save for the occasional creak of the old house settling. But by the third night, the silence gave way to faint noises. It began with whispers, just at the edge of hearing. Hannah chalked it up to wind through the cracks. When the whispers turned to footsteps in the hallway, she told herself it was rodents. But then the knocking began. It was soft at first, rhythmic and deliberate. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Always at 3:15 a.m., it echoed through the house, pulling Hannah from her restless sleep. She would lie frozen in her bed, clutching the covers, her breath shallow until it stopped. Determined not to succumb to paranoia, she decided to explore the source. On the 5th night, she armed herself with a flashlight and ventured into the hallway. The knocking had started again, and it seemed to be coming from the library, a room she had yet to enter. The library was vast, its walls lined with dusty bookshelves. At the center stood a grand fireplace, cold and unused. As Hannah approached, her flashlight flickered. She cursed under her breath and slapped it, the beam sputtering back to life. That's when she saw it. A woman stood by the farthest bookshelf, her back turned. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown, her dark hair cascading down her back. Hannah froze, her voice caught in her throat. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Trembling, Hannah approached the spot where the woman had stood. The air was icy, and she noticed something peculiar. A single book lay on the floor, its leather cover cracked with age. The title read, The Harwick Chronicle. Inside, the book chronicled the history of the manor. It told of its original owner, Lydia Harwick, a young widow who had vanished under mysterious circumstances in 1873. Her body was never found, but locals claimed her spirit lingered, mourning her untimely death. Over the next few days, Hannah couldn't shake the memory of the woman in the library. She began to see her more frequently, not just in the library, but in mirrors, at the edge of her vision, or standing at the foot of her bed. The figure never spoke, never moved, but her presence was suffocating. One stormy night, driven by equal parts fear and curiosity, Hannah decided to delve deeper into the mystery. Armed with a lantern and a crowbar, she ventured into the manor's basement, a place she had avoided since her arrival. The air grew colder with each step she descended, the damp walls weeping moisture. At the far end of the basement, she discovered a wooden hatch, its hinges rusted. She pried it open, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and Hannah had to cover her nose with her sleeve as she descended. At the bottom of the staircase, she found a small, windowless room. In the center stood a wooden table, its surface marred by deep scratches. Chains hung from the walls, and scattered across the floor were faded photographs of Lydia Harwick. They were torn and burned at the edges, as if someone had tried to erase her from existence. Hannah's gaze fell on a shallow pit in the corner, filled with loose soil. Something glinted within it. She knelt, her hands trembling as she unearthed a locket. Inside was a photograph of Lydia and a man she didn't recognize. The back bore an inscription, "Forever yours, E.H." As she stood, a cold breath swept across her neck. She spun around, the lantern's light slicing through the darkness. The woman from the library stood before her, her face pale and hollow, her eyes pools of black. This time she spoke, her voice echoing as if carried by the wind. "Help me." The room seemed to shudder, the chains rattling on the walls. The lantern flickered wildly. Hannah stumbled backward, clutching the locket. "What do you want?" she screamed. The ghost pointed to the pit, her translucent finger quivering. Realizing what she needed to do, Hannah grabbed a nearby shovel and began digging. The soil was loose, and it didn't take long to uncover what lay beneath. A skeletal hand, its bony fingers curled around a knife. The room exploded with sound, screams, cries, and the clanging of chains. The ghost of Lydia Harwick hovered above the pit, her form writhing as if in agony. Hannah fell to her knees, covering her ears as the cacophony reached its peak. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The basement was silent. When Hannah opened her eyes, the ghost was gone. In her place stood a man, his face twisted with rage. He was solid, too real to be a mere apparition. He lunged at her, his movements jerky and unnatural. Hannah swung the shovel, connecting with his head. He dissolved into mist, his scream echoing as he vanished. The locket in her hand grew warm, then cold, as if expelling the last remnants of his presence. Hannah fled the basement, slamming the hatch shut behind her. She packed her belongings that night and left the manor without looking back. Months later, she learned that the manor had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. The official report cited faulty wiring, but the locals knew better. They said Lydia Harwick's spirit had finally found peace, her tragic story reduced to ashes. Hannah never returned to Blackwater, but sometimes late at night, she would dream of Lydia. In those dreams, the ghost would smile, her eyes no longer hollow, and whisper, "Thank you." Story the end.
Story number 2.
The heavy rains had started early that October, and by the time Sarah arrived in the town of Hollow Creek, the sky seemed perpetually shrouded in gray. Her uncle Henry had died a month earlier, and the family lawyer had summoned her to take possession of the old estate he'd left behind. Sarah didn't know much about her uncle. He'd been a recluse, and the family rarely spoke of him. But the house was hers now, an inheritance that felt more like a burden than a gift. She had planned to sell it as soon as possible and return to her apartment in the city. The house sat at the edge of a dense forest, its outline barely visible through the sheets of rain. It was an enormous, creaking Victorian structure, with peeling paint and darkened windows that stared out like hollow eyes. The locals had been reluctant to give her directions. "That place has a history," the old man at the gas station muttered when she asked. "Not a good one." Ignoring his warning, Sarah drove up the muddy driveway, her car tires skidding as they climbed the hill. The house loomed above her, an architectural relic frozen in decay. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the heavy door groaned as it opened. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying a faint, sour smell of mildew and something metallic. The first few days passed uneventfully. The house was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional drip of rainwater leaking through the ceiling or the moaning groan of wood shifting under its own weight. The electricity worked sporadically, and Sarah relied on a battery-powered lantern to light her way through the labyrinth of rooms. She spent most of her time sorting through her uncle's belongings, uncovering a life she knew little about. In the study, she found shelves of dusty books and an ornate desk cluttered with faded photographs. Most were of her uncle in his younger years, often standing beside a striking woman with long, dark hair. There were no names written on the backs, but one particular photo caught her eye. A candid shot of the woman standing in the garden behind the house, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a voice just out of frame. Her eyes seemed to follow Sarah no matter how she turned the photograph. That night, Sarah woke to a sound she couldn't place. It wasn't the creak of the house or the patter of rain, but something rhythmic, deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, slow and measured, pacing somewhere above her. She held her breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, leaving only the ticking of an old clock in the hallway. She told herself it was just her imagination. The house was old, full of peculiar noises, but the next night the footsteps returned, louder this time and closer. Sarah sat up in bed, clutching the blankets tightly. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering. Silence answered her. The following day, she explored the second floor, determined to put her fears to rest. Most of the rooms were empty, their doors warped and their floors layered with dust. At the end of the hallway, she found a door that was locked. The key, small and ornate, was in her uncle's desk drawer. The room beyond was a bedroom, unlike any of the others. It looked as though it had been untouched for decades. The bed was neatly made, its sheets yellowed with age, and an old vanity stood against the wall, its mirror clouded and speckled with black. On the vanity was a jewelry box, its lid slightly ajar. Inside was a collection of trinkets, rings, a bracelet, and a locket. The locket caught Sarah's attention. It was gold, delicate, and engraved with the initials EM. When she opened it, her stomach tightened. Inside was a photograph of the woman from the garden. That night, the footsteps came again, but this time they were accompanied by a faint whispering. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakably female. It seemed to drift through the walls, weaving in and out of her consciousness. Her pulse raced as she clutched the locket, unsure why she hadn't put it down since finding it. The whispers grew louder in the days that followed, and Sarah began to feel as though she were never alone. She'd catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow darting across a room, the faint swish of a dress disappearing around a corner. Once, she woke to find the locket open on the nightstand, though she was certain she had closed it before bed. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah searched the house for clues about her uncle's life and the mysterious woman in the photographs. In the attic, she discovered an old trunk filled with letters. Many of them were addressed to her uncle and signed Evelyn. The letters spoke of a love affair that had been passionate but tumultuous. Evelyn had lived in the house with him for years, but the final letter, dated over 30 years ago, hinted at something darker. "I cannot stay here any longer," it read. "You've changed, Henry. This house has changed you. I'm leaving tonight, and I beg you not to stop me." Sarah's chest tightened as she read the words. She had to know what had happened to Evelyn. She searched the house again, this time with a desperation that bordered on panic. It was in the basement that she found the truth. The door to the basement was hidden behind a bookshelf in the study, the hinges barely visible in the dim light. The stairs descended into cold, damp darkness. The air grew heavier with each step, and the smell of earth and decay became overwhelming. At the far end of the basement was a small alcove, its walls lined with old stone. In the center was a shallow grave, the earth disturbed and loose. Something protruded from the dirt, a fragment of bone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the air around her turned icy. A presence filled the room, pressing down on her like a weight. She turned and saw her. Evelyn stood in the shadows, her figure faint and flickering like a dying flame. Her eyes were hollow and her mouth opened in a silent scream. The locket in Sarah's hand grew searingly hot and she dropped it with a cry. The ghost moved toward her, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Help me," Evelyn's voice echoed, though her lips didn't move. The lights flickered and the walls seemed to close in. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding as the ghost's icy fingers brushed her arm. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a nearby shovel and began to dig. The soil was loose, and it didn't take long to uncover what lay beneath, a skeletal hand clutching a dagger. As she unearthed more, she found the rest of Evelyn's remains, the bones still twisted in a pose of agony. The ghost let out a wailing cry, the sound reverberating through the house. The lights flared, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. When Sarah's eyes adjusted, Evelyn was gone. The air was still, and the oppressive weight had lifted. Sarah called the authorities the next morning. The remains were identified as Evelyn's, and it was confirmed that she had been murdered, stabbed in the chest multiple times. Her uncle had never been suspected, but the evidence was undeniable. Sarah left Hollow Creek the same day, leaving the house to be sold to the highest bidder. She couldn't stay, not after what she had uncovered. The locket, however, remained with her. She couldn't explain why, but she felt it was the only way to keep Evelyn's memory alive. Months later, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment, she caught sight of a figure in the mirror. A woman with long, dark hair stood behind her, watching. When Sarah turned, the room was empty. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the dense pines of Ashwick Forest as Daniel pulled his truck up the winding gravel path. The GPS had long since given up, insisting he'd arrived in the middle of nowhere. But the address was clear: 112 Wraith Hollow Road. His best friend Mark had bought the cabin sight unseen for a steal, boasting of their upcoming weekend as off-grid luxury. Now, as Daniel stared at the cabin, he wondered what Mark had been thinking. The place looked ancient, with moss creeping up the walls and the windows clouded with grime. The air was thick with dampness and decay, as though the forest was trying to reclaim the structure. Mark greeted him at the door with a grin, the smell of beer already wafting from inside. "You're late. Come in, man. You won't believe how cool this place is." The interior wasn't much better. The furniture was old and mismatched, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. But the fireplace was roaring and the fridge was stocked, so Daniel shrugged it off. They'd been planning this weekend for months, just the two of them, some fishing gear and a stack of horror movies. That first night was uneventful. They sat by the fire, trading stories and laughing until the late hours. But when Daniel went to bed, the strangeness began. At first, it was subtle. A faint creaking noise, as if someone were walking upstairs. He assumed it was Mark until he remembered that the cabin didn't have a second floor. He tried to brush it off as the old house settling, but the sound persisted, steady footsteps pacing back and forth above him. The next morning, he asked Mark if he'd heard anything. Mark just laughed. "This place is creepy, sure, but don't let it get to you. Old wood makes noise." Daniel didn't want to press the issue, but something about the footsteps stayed with him. That night, as they sat by the fire again, he noticed how quiet the woods were. No crickets, no owls, just the crackling of the flames and the distant rustle of leaves. "You don't think this place is haunted, do you?" Daniel asked, only half joking. Mark chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to his voice. "If it is, the ghost better know how to fish. We've got a big day tomorrow." But that night, the noises escalated. Daniel woke to the sound of whispering, faint and indistinct. It seemed to be coming from just outside his bedroom window. He lay frozen, straining to make out the words, but they were too soft, like voices carried by the wind. Then came the knocking. It started as a single deliberate rap against the window, then two more. The rhythm was unsettling, too deliberate to be a branch or an animal. Heart pounding, Daniel grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, he approached the window. Outside, the forest was dark and still. No movement, no sign of anyone. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, just as he was about to climb back into bed, a voice whispered his name. "Daniel?" It wasn't Mark's voice. It wasn't even close. It was raspy, almost wet-sounding, like someone choking out the words. Daniel bolted out of the room and into the living area, where he found Mark already awake, his face pale. "You heard it too?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. Daniel nodded. "What the hell is going on?" Mark hesitated before answering. "I didn't tell you everything about this place. The realtor mentioned stories. The locals say it's cursed. People who stay here, well, let's just say they don't always leave." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "And you still brought me here?" "I didn't think it was real," Mark snapped. "It's just a story, right? Ghosts aren't real." But as they stood there arguing, the knocking started again. This time, it came from the front door. Mark grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door, Daniel close behind. "We're not alone out here," Mark muttered, throwing open the door. The porch was empty. The flashlight beam swept across the forest, but nothing moved. The only sound was the wind in the trees. Then they saw the footprints. They were deep and wet, as though someone had been standing barefoot in the mud. The trail led from the porch steps into the woods, vanishing into the undergrowth. "We need to leave," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "Now." Mark hesitated, but another knock, this one louder and more forceful, made the decision for them. They grabbed their keys and ran to the truck, but as Mark turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. Come on," Mark muttered, trying again. The truck refused to start. The knocking returned, louder this time, coming from the truck's windows. Daniel turned and screamed. A face was pressed against the glass, a pale, sunken visage with hollow eyes and a wide, toothless grin. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Go," Daniel shouted, but the truck remained dead. The knocking grew more frantic, echoing from all sides. The cabin door swung open, though no one was there. Shadows moved in the doorway, their shapes indistinct but undeniably human. Mark and Daniel bolted from the truck and into the woods, running blindly through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around them, the branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more insistent. Daniel, Mark. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, they realized they had no idea where they were. The forest was impenetrably dark, and the flashlight's beam barely cut through the gloom. "We're lost," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Then the whispers turned to laughter. Low and guttural, it surrounded them, echoing from every direction. Daniel turned, and for a moment he thought he saw figures moving in the trees, pale and skeletal, their limbs impossibly long. The laughter grew louder, almost deafening, and then the flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed them whole. By morning, the cabin was empty. Mark's truck sat where they had left it, the doors open and the keys still in the ignition. A search party found no trace of the two men, though the forest floor was littered with footprints, bare, wet, and inhumanly large. Locals say the cabin still stands, though no one dares go near it. Sometimes on quiet nights, hikers report hearing whispers in the woods, calling out for Daniel and Mark. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The town of Ravenswood was quiet in the winter, its streets dusted with snow and its fields blanketed in an icy stillness. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where people whispered stories about the past because the present held nothing new. But there was one story no one dared whisper, not after dark. It was the story of the old Lockwood house, sitting abandoned at the end of Briar Lane, its windows dark and its halls silent since the night the Lockwood family vanished. Clara wasn't from Ravenswood. She didn't know the stories, and even if she had, she probably wouldn't have believed them. She was a journalist for a small magazine, tasked with writing a feature on America's most haunted towns. Ravenswood, with its eerie reputation and untouched Victorian charm, was the perfect candidate. The Lockwood house, she was told, was the crown jewel of the town's dark history. "It's just a house," Clara muttered to herself as she parked her rental car outside the wrought iron gate. The house stood tall and imposing, its pointed gables and peeling paint giving it the look of a rotting cathedral. Snow had piled up on the porch steps, undisturbed for years. A tangle of dead ivy clung to the walls like veins. She hesitated before stepping out of the car. Her breath fogged in the freezing air as she approached the gate, which swung open with a rusty creak. "Perfect," she muttered, shivering as the wind whipped her scarf. She pulled out her camera, snapping pictures of the exterior. The door, surprisingly, was unlocked. It groaned on its hinges as she pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer coated in dust. A chandelier hung above, its crystals dulled by time, and an ornate staircase curved upward into darkness. Clara's boots left prints in the thick layer of grime as she stepped inside. The air was heavy, carrying a faint, acrid smell like burned paper. She began her tour, her camera flashing as she documented each room. The furniture was still there, chairs draped in yellowing sheets, a grand piano in the parlor with keys that looked brittle to the touch. It was as if the Lockwoods had just left, though the house had clearly been abandoned for decades. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, but every now and then she thought she heard something else, a faint creak overhead, the soft rustle of fabric, the sound of a breath that wasn't hers. In the dining room, she found a long table set with dusty plates and tarnished silverware. A decanter of dark liquid sat in the center, untouched. Her fingers itched to touch it to see if the liquid had congealed or evaporated, but she resisted. Instead, she took a picture. When the flash went off, she thought for just a moment she saw something in the corner of the room. A figure, pale and indistinct. She spun around, her heart hammering. The corner was empty. "Get a grip," she muttered, but her voice sounded too loud in the cavernous room. She moved on, climbing the staircase to the second floor. The upstairs hallway was long and dark, lined with closed doors. Clara shone her flashlight along the walls, illuminating faded wallpaper and family portraits. One painting in particular caught her eye, a woman in a dark gown, her expression severe, her eyes almost lifelike. The plaque beneath read, "Eleanor Lockwood, 1892. As Clara stepped closer, she felt a strange chill, as if the air around the painting were colder. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her, and Clara had the sudden, inexplicable urge to apologize, though she didn't know why. She continued down the hall, opening doors at random. Most rooms were empty, their furniture draped and forgotten. But one door at the end of the hall was different. It was locked. Clara jiggled the handle, frustration flaring. "Come on," she muttered. She looked around for something to pry it open, but found nothing. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a click. Slowly, the door creaked open on its own. Inside was a bedroom, untouched by time. The bed was neatly made, its lace canopy yellowed but intact. A vanity stood against the wall, its mirror cracked but still reflective. Clara stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by an ornate rug. On the vanity was a music box, its delicate carvings coated in dust. She couldn't resist. Gently, she turned the small key on the side and lifted the lid. A haunting melody filled the room, soft and lilting, the kind of tune that might have comforted a child on a stormy night. As the music played, Clara noticed something in the mirror. It wasn't her reflection. It was a woman, standing behind her, dressed in black, her face obscured by a dark veil. Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty. The music box stopped abruptly, the melody cutting off mid-note. Clara slammed the lid shut, her hands shaking. She backed out of the room, her heart racing. She didn't want to stay any longer. Whatever story this house held, she didn't need to know it anymore. But as she descended the staircase, she felt it again, that sense of being watched. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to deepen, crawling up the walls like living things. She reached the foyer and froze. The front door, which had been ajar, was now closed, and standing in front of it was the woman from the mirror. This time, Clara could see her face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with hatred. The woman raised a hand, pointing at Clara, and a sound filled the room, a low, guttural wail that grew into a scream. The chandelier above began to shake, its crystals clinking like wind chimes in a storm. Clara ran. She didn't think, didn't look back. She bolted toward the nearest door and flung it open, finding herself in the parlor. The piano played a single discordant note as she passed, though no one was there. She stumbled through another door and into the kitchen. The cabinets slammed open and shut on their own, dishes shattering on the floor. A shadow moved across the room, too fast to follow. Finally, she found a side door and burst into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. The gate, which had opened so easily before, now resisted as she pushed it, her hands freezing against the iron bars. It finally gave way and she jumped into her car, her fingers fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, Clara glanced back at the house. The windows were no longer dark. Every room was lit, and in the upstairs hallway she saw the shadowy figure of the woman watching her leave. Clara drove straight out of Ravenswood, not stopping until she reached the highway. She never wrote the article, never spoke of what happened. But sometimes late at night she would hear the melody of the music box in her dreams, and she'd wake with the sensation of being watched. She didn't keep the photographs she'd taken, but one remained, folded at the bottom of her bag, forgotten. It was the picture of the dining room, and in the corner, faint but unmistakable, was the figure of the woman in black. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The cold November rain poured relentlessly as Amanda drove along the winding back roads of Maplewood. She hadn't planned to take this route, but a detour on the highway had forced her onto unfamiliar paths. Her GPS kept recalculating, offering cryptic directions that only seemed to lead her deeper into the forest. The sun had set hours ago, and the headlights of her old sedan barely cut through the dense fog that clung to the trees. The road narrowed further until it was little more than a dirt path. Amanda muttered a curse under her breath, gripping the wheel tightly as her tires slid through the muddy ruts. She checked her phone again, but the signal was gone. The battery icon blinked red, 3%. That was when she saw the house. It appeared out of nowhere, nestled in a clearing just off the road. Its silhouette was dark against the fog, its peaked roof and shuttered windows giving it an ominous, skeletal appearance. A flicker of light came from inside, faint but unmistakable. Amanda hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to keep driving. But the road ahead was treacherous, and her car was already struggling. The thought of spending the night in the freezing cold, stranded in the middle of nowhere, was worse than whatever unease the house gave her. She pulled up to the overgrown driveway and killed the engine. Just ask for directions, she told herself as she grabbed her jacket and flashlight. The rain soaked her within seconds as she approached the front door. It was massive and weathered, its wood warped and splintered. A brass knocker in the shape of a wolf's head hung in the center. She knocked twice. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house were hollow. No one answered. She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Amanda was about to turn back to her car when the door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" she called, stepping inside. The air was stale and carried a faint, metallic tang. "Is anyone here?" The entryway was dimly lit by an old chandelier, its bulbs flickering erratically. The floor was covered in a faded rug, and the walls were lined with cracked wallpaper that seemed to peel before her eyes. "Hello?" she called again, her voice sounding small against the oppressive silence. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, making her jump. She tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to creep in, but she forced herself to stay calm. Someone had to be here. The light in the window, she'd seen it. Amanda walked further into the house, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. The hallway led her to a large sitting room. A fire burned low in the hearth, its embers casting flickering shadows on the walls. An old armchair faced the flames, but it was empty. The room felt lived in. There were books scattered across the coffee table, a cup of tea sitting beside them. Steam still rose from the cup as though it had been poured moments ago. Amanda frowned. "Hello?" She tried again, louder this time. "I need help. My car." A floorboard creaked above her, cutting her off. She froze, listening. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved across the ceiling, heading toward the staircase at the far end of the room. Her flashlight flickered as she pointed it toward the stairs. She strained her eyes but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was unbearable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she debated whether to call out again or leave. Then she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, drifting down from the second floor. Amanda? Her name. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't told anyone her name. She took a step back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The air in the room grew colder, and the fire in the hearth sputtered before going out entirely. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the faint beam of her flashlight. "Amanda?" The voice came again, closer this time, as though someone were descending the stairs. Her fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She turned and bolted, running back the way she'd come. The hallway seemed longer than she remembered, stretching endlessly before her. The chandelier flickered, its light revealing fleeting shadows that darted along the walls. When she reached the front door, she yanked at the knob with all her strength, but it refused to open. She turned to look for another way out and froze. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden beneath a veil of long, matted hair. Its hands were outstretched, the fingers impossibly long, almost claw-like. Amanda screamed and stumbled back. The figure moved toward her, its steps slow and deliberate, its body twitching unnaturally with every movement. "Please," Amanda begged, her voice breaking. "I just want to leave." The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering her plea. Then it raised one hand and pointed toward the staircase. "No," Amanda whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going up there." The house groaned, the sound reverberating through the walls. The figure tilted its head again, more forcefully this time, its clawed hand still pointing. Against every instinct, Amanda found herself stepping toward the stairs. Her legs felt heavy, as though she were moving through water, but she couldn't stop. The figure remained at the end of the hallway, watching as she climbed the steps. The second floor was worse. The air was colder, and the metallic smell was stronger. The hallway was lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. From behind them came faint whispers, all calling her name. She reached the end of the hall, where a single door stood closed. Her hand trembled as she reached for the knob. The whispers stopped as the door creaked open. Inside was a small bedroom. The walls were lined with children's drawings. Their colors faded, but still vibrant enough to make out the figures. Amanda stepped closer and saw that every drawing depicted the same thing. A tall, dark figure with clawed hands, standing in the doorway of a house. On the bed sat a small music box. It was open, playing a haunting melody that sent shivers down her spine. As she reached for it, a hand shot out from beneath the bed, grabbing her ankle. Amanda screamed as she was pulled to the floor. The hand was cold and skeletal, its grip impossibly strong. She kicked and struggled, her flashlight tumbling from her grasp. Shadows swirled around her, and the room seemed to dissolve into darkness. The last thing she saw was the figure from the hallway, leaning over her, its face inches from hers. Its hollow eyes burned like embers as it whispered her name one final time. Amanda's car was found 2 days later, abandoned at the side of the road. The house, however, was never located. Locals say no such house exists on Briar Lane, though travelers often report seeing lights flickering in the woods. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The rain battered against the windshield as Emma squinted through the wiper blades, smearing water across the glass. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the 2-lane highway wound deeper into the forest, the edges of the road dissolving into a pitch-black abyss. Her GPS had died an hour ago, and she hadn't seen another car for at least twice that long. She glanced at her phone. No signal. Just the glowing, mocking icon of an empty bar. The battery icon warned her she only had 10% left. "Fantastic," she muttered, her voice tight. She wasn't supposed to be here. The highway was a last-minute detour after a sign announced that the main route was closed for construction. The clerk at the gas station had assured her this was a shortcut. A shortcut to where exactly? She whispered bitterly. The headlights illuminated a wooden sign nailed to a tree ahead. It swung precariously in the wind. As she passed it, the letters Ravenwood Motel, 2 miles, gleamed faintly in peeling white paint. Relief washed over her. A place to stop for the night. The motel emerged like a specter from the trees. Its flickering neon sign cast jagged shadows on the gravel parking lot. The main building was a squat, 2-story structure, its paint peeling and windows smudged with grime. A single light burned in the front office. Emma parked and stepped out into the rain. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic. As she crossed the lot, she noticed only 2 other cars, both covered in a thin layer of dirt and leaves. Inside the office, a bell jingled as she pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and a small desk fan rattled on a counter. Behind it sat a man in his 50s, his face pale and slightly gaunt. He looked up from a battered magazine and smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Yes, please," Emma replied, shivering. "Just for the night." He slid a logbook across the counter. "Sign in here. Cash only." She hesitated but scribbled her name. She had just enough cash in her wallet to cover the $40 he requested. The man handed her a tarnished key attached to a cracked plastic tag that read, "Room 7. "Last one on the left," he said. "Thanks," she murmured. As she left the office, she noticed the man watching her through the window, his face partially obscured by the reflection of the neon sign. The room was just as dismal as she'd expected. The wallpaper was yellowed and peeling at the edges, and the bedspread was a faded floral pattern that reeked faintly of mothballs. A single lamp on the nightstand cast a feeble light, and the bathroom door creaked loudly when she pushed it open. Emma set her phone to charge and peeled off her damp clothes. The shower sputtered before releasing a weak stream of lukewarm water. She let it wash over her, rinsing away the grime of the road and the clinging unease of the motel. By the time she stepped out, the room felt oppressively quiet. She hadn't noticed it before, but there were no sounds outside, no wind, no rain, not even the hum of insects. It was as if the world had been muted. She slipped into bed and turned off the light, the darkness pressing in around her. Just as her breathing began to slow, a faint tapping sound came from the wall behind her headboard. Tap, tap, tap. Emma froze, her heart pounding. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. She sat up and strained to listen. "Probably just pipes," she whispered to herself. The sound stopped. Relieved, she sank back into the pillows. But just as her eyes fluttered closed, the tapping resumed, louder this time. It seemed to be coming not from the wall, but from inside the room. She bolted upright and fumbled for the light. The bulb flickered on, casting long shadows across the room. Her eyes darted to the corners, the closet, the bathroom door. Nothing. "Get it together," she muttered, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She crossed the room and opened the bathroom door. The light buzzed overhead, and the mirror was fogged from her earlier shower. She wiped it with her hand. But as her reflection came into focus, she saw movement behind her, a shadow darting across the room. Emma whirled around, her breath hitching. The room was empty. Her hands trembled as she backed toward the bed, grabbing her phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up, but the signal was still dead. She checked the time, 2:13 a.m. Suddenly, the tapping turned into a loud, insistent banging. It came from the closet door. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. The banging grew louder, more frantic. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. The noise stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, the closet door creaked open an inch. Emma stared, her body frozen. A single pale hand slid out, fingers long and unnaturally thin. It gripped the edge of the door and pushed it open further. She screamed and scrambled for the door to the room, fumbling with the lock. Behind her, the closet door slammed open, and she heard heavy, wet footsteps approaching. Emma flung the door open and ran into the night, the gravel biting into her bare feet. The rain had stopped, but the air was colder than before, her breath forming clouds as she sprinted toward the office. She burst inside, the bell jangling wildly. "Help!" she cried. "There's someone in my room!" The man behind the counter looked up slowly. His expression was blank, almost bored. "What room?" he asked. "7, she panted. "Someone's in there. Please call the police." The man's gaze flicked to the logbook, then back to her. "Room 7's been empty for years." Emma shook her head violently. "No, I checked in. You gave me the key." The man frowned, then pulled out a drawer beneath the counter. He lifted the key to room 7, the cracked plastic tag dangling from his fingers. Emma's stomach dropped. She turned slowly, her eyes darting to the parking lot outside. Her car was gone. The other cars were gone. "What's going on?" she whispered. The man didn't answer. He simply smiled, the same hollow smile as before, and then the tapping began again. This time, it came from the walls of the office. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Emma's windshield wipers strained against the downpour, their rhythmic swish barely cutting through the sheets of rain. She leaned closer to the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she tried to make out the next bend in the road. The dense forest loomed on either side of the narrow highway, its skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Her GPS had given up 30 minutes ago, its screen frozen on a buffering wheel. Her phone? Dead. She'd promised herself she'd charge it at the next stop, but the miles stretched endlessly with no sign of civilization. Finally, through the curtain of rain, a flickering neon light emerged, a beacon in the dark. The words Clearview Motel blinked faintly, their glow casting eerie shadows on the wet asphalt. The building behind it was low and sprawling, its cracked stucco walls stained with moss. Relief washed over her as she pulled into the empty parking lot. She stepped out, pulling her jacket tight against the rain, and hurried toward the front office. The bell above the door tinkled weakly as she entered. The air inside was heavy with the scent of mildew and cheap air freshener. Behind the counter sat a man, his face thin and hollow-cheeked, his glasses slightly askew. He looked up from a crossword puzzle and smiled, a tight, perfunctory smile that didn't quite reach his sunken eyes. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes, just for the night," Emma said, glancing around. The walls were covered in faded wood paneling, and the only decoration was a calendar from 3 years ago. "Lucky you," the man said, sliding a key across the counter. "We've only got one room available, room 9. She nodded, taking the key. "Thanks. How much?" "Pay when you leave," he replied, his smile widening slightly. Emma hesitated but didn't argue. She just wanted to sleep. Room 9 was at the far end of the row of doors. The room itself was as dreary as the office. Stained carpet, peeling wallpaper, and a faint smell of dampness that seemed to permeate everything. The bed, at least, looked clean enough, with a quilted coverlet in an ugly floral pattern. She plugged her phone into the charger, noting with irritation that the outlet was loose and barely held the plug. A glance at her watch told her it was just past 11 p.m. She decided to forgo a shower and changed into a pair of sweatpants and a hoodie, collapsing onto the bed with a sigh. The silence was unsettling. No rain, no wind, not even the hum of insects outside, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. She was on the verge of sleep when the noise began. Tap, tap, tap! Emma's eyes shot open. The sound was faint at first, but unmistakable, a soft, deliberate tapping. She sat up, her heart thudding in her chest. It was coming from the wall behind the headboard. Probably just the pipes, she muttered, trying to reassure herself. But as she lay back down, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap! 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 She stared at the ceiling, her breath catching in her throat. It sounded too deliberate, too measured to be a plumbing issue. Gathering her courage, she got up and crossed the room, her bare feet sinking into the threadbare carpet. The tapping stopped as soon as she moved. She placed her ear against the wall, holding her breath. Silence. She stepped back, shaking her head. Just the wind, she whispered. As she turned to head back to bed, the closet door creaked open. Emma froze. Her reflection in the room's grimy mirror stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. The closet door was ajar now, a sliver of darkness spilling out into the room. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. She took a step closer, her heart hammering. Her hand shook as she reached for the door handle. She pulled it open in one swift motion. Nothing. The closet was empty, its contents a single rusted coat hanger swinging gently on the rail. Emma let out a nervous laugh, running a hand through her hair. "Get a grip," she muttered. She closed the closet door firmly and returned to the bed. But as soon as she lay down, the tapping resumed, this time from the window. Her stomach twisted. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window, the thin curtains barely concealing the shadow of a figure standing just outside. Emma's breath hitched. She scrambled off the bed, grabbing her phone from the nightstand. The screen was dark. The outlet had failed to charge it. She backed toward the door, her gaze locked on the window. The shadow didn't move, but she could feel it watching her. Her trembling hands fumbled with the lock, and just as she pulled the door open, the light in the room flickered out. She bolted into the night, the gravel of the parking lot sharp under her bare feet. The front office was just ahead, its light still glowing faintly. She burst through the door, the bell clanging violently. "Someone's outside my room!" she gasped. The man behind the counter looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "Room 9?" he asked. Emma nodded frantically, his thin lips curled into a faint smile. "We don't rent room 9 anymore." Her blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about? You gave me the key." The man tilted his head. "Room 9's been empty for years. We had an incident." Emma stumbled back, shaking her head. No, I was just there." "Where's your car?" the man interrupted. She froze, her heart plummeting. She turned toward the parking lot. Her car was gone. The lot was empty, save for a single rusted sedan. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood, his gaunt frame seeming to stretch unnaturally tall. His shadow loomed over her, darker and longer than it should have been. Emma backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. The tapping began again. This time it came from inside the office. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The road stretched endlessly before her, its surface slick with rain and illuminated only by the pale glow of her car's headlights. Caroline gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white. She hated driving at night, especially through isolated countryside like this. The GPS on her dashboard showed no signs of life. Its screen displayed an unhelpful recalculating for the past half hour. The storm had been a surprise. She hadn't checked the weather before leaving the city, assuming the 3-hour drive to her friend's cabin would be uneventful. Instead, she found herself navigating twisting roads through dense forests, each turn feeling more disorienting than the last. Her phone was as unhelpful as the GPS, its signal non-existent since she had left the main highway. As she rounded another bend, her headlights caught a figure standing on the side of the road. Caroline's heart lurched. A man was waving, his arm raised high, his other hand gripping what looked like a backpack. "Jesus," she muttered, slamming on the brakes. Her tires skidded briefly on the wet asphalt before the car came to a stop. The man jogged toward her window, his face illuminated by the interior light as she rolled it down. He looked to be in his late 20s, drenched from head to toe, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. "Thank you so much for stopping," he said, his voice slightly breathless. "My car broke down a couple of miles back, and I've been walking for hours." Caroline hesitated. Every warning she'd ever heard about picking up strangers flashed through her mind. "I just need a ride to the nearest town," he added quickly, as if sensing her reluctance. "Please, there's no cell service out here, and I think the storm's getting worse." She glanced at the empty road ahead, then back at him. He didn't look dangerous, just cold, wet, and desperate. "All right," she said finally. "Get in." The man's face lit up with relief. He opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, dropping his soaked backpack at his feet. "Thank you," he said again, shivering. Caroline nodded, pulling back onto the road. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere with a phone or a tow truck," he replied, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Name's David, by the way." "Caroline," she said. They drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the patter of rain on the roof and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. Caroline kept stealing glances at him. He seemed harmless enough, staring out the window at the dark forest. "You're sure there's a town ahead?" she asked after a few minutes. He hesitated. "I think so. I saw a sign for a place called Black Hollow a few miles before my car broke down." Caroline frowned. She didn't remember passing any signs, but then again, she'd been too focused on the road to notice much of anything. As they continued, the road seemed to narrow, the trees pressing closer on either side. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. Then, out of nowhere, the car jolted violently. Caroline screamed, slamming on the brakes as the vehicle lurched to a stop. "What the hell was that?" she gasped, her heart racing. David was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Stay here," he said. "I'll check." He stepped out into the rain, disappearing around the front of the car. Caroline sat frozen, her hands gripping the wheel. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Seconds stretched into minutes. David didn't return. "David?" she called, rolling down the window slightly. The rain lashed against her face, but there was no response. She grabbed her phone out of habit, but the screen mocked her with its "no service" message. "Damn it," she muttered, opening the door. The rain was icy, soaking through her jacket almost instantly. She rounded the car, expecting to find David inspecting a flat tire or debris in the road. Instead, she found nothing. David was gone. "David?" she shouted, her voice rising. The road ahead was empty, the forest on either side a wall of impenetrable darkness. She turned in a circle, her panic mounting. "David, this isn't funny." A faint sound reached her ears, a rustling coming from the trees. Caroline froze, her breath hitching. "David?" she called again, her voice trembling. The rustling grew louder, closer. She backed toward the car, her eyes scanning the tree line. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was David. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. But as it stepped into the glow of the headlights, she realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't him. The thing's skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth was a jagged gash that seemed to grin as it moved closer. Caroline screamed and dove back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her hands fumbled for the keys, but they weren't in the ignition. No, she whimpered, frantically searching the seat and floor. The thing reached the car, its skeletal hand slapping against the window, its face pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. Caroline screamed again, pounding on the horn. The sound blared into the night, but the creature didn't flinch. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped back. For a moment, she thought it was leaving. But then she realized it wasn't retreating, it was circling the car. Caroline's breath came in shallow gasps as she followed its movements. It disappeared from view, and she heard the faint sound of the trunk latch clicking. Her heart sank. She remembered David placing his backpack there earlier. The trunk lid creaked open. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. A loud thud came from the roof of the car, followed by the sound of something heavy sliding across it. Caroline couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her only instinct was to run. She grabbed the door handle and threw it open, bolting into the storm. The rain blinded her as she ran, her bare feet slipping on the asphalt. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away. Behind her, she heard the creature screech, a high-pitched wail that sent chills down her spine. She ran faster, her lungs burning, her legs aching. The road stretched on endlessly, the forest a black void on either side. And then, up ahead, she saw it. A faint light, flickering through the trees. She stumbled toward it, her hope surging. As she got closer, she realized it was a house, a small, weathered cabin with a single light burning in the window. Caroline pounded on the door, her voice hoarse. "Help me! Please, someone's out there!" The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with kind eyes and a shawl draped over her shoulders. "Goodness, child," the woman said, pulling Caroline inside. "You're soaked to the bone. What happened? There's something out there, Caroline stammered. It's not human. It was chasing me. The woman's expression darkened. She closed the door and locked it, drawing the curtains over the windows. You saw it, didn't you? The woman asked softly. Caroline frowned. You know about it? The woman nodded gravely. The woods aren't safe at night. That thing, it's been here for years, taking travelers who don't know better than to stop. Caroline's blood ran cold. What is it? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she handed Caroline a blanket and gestured for her to sit by the fire. As Caroline sat, her body shaking, she realized the woman was staring out the window, her face pale and fearful. And then Caroline heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the door. Story. The end.
Story number 9.
The diner stood alone at the edge of a stretch of empty road, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the dark sky. A few scattered cars were parked outside, their hoods gleaming wetly in the drizzle. James pulled his truck into the lot, the engine sputtering before he shut it off. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the clock on his dash blinked past midnight. Inside, the diner was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The air smelled of grease and old coffee, and a worn jukebox in the corner flickered faintly, playing nothing. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her uniform crisp but outdated, and she smiled at him as he entered. "Just you tonight?" she asked, her voice carrying a strange lilting cadence. James nodded, glancing around. Only 2 other people were inside. An older man hunched over a cup of coffee in a booth near the back, and a young woman sitting alone at the counter, idly stirring a bowl of soup. "Anywhere you like," the waitress said, sliding a laminated menu onto the counter. James took a seat near the window, where he could watch the rain streak down the glass. He wasn't sure why, but the place gave him a bad feeling. Something about the silence, the way the fluorescent lights flickered just slightly too much, made the back of his neck prickle. The waitress appeared again, pen poised over a notepad. "What can I get you?" "Just a burger and fries," he said, handing her the menu. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. James leaned back, rubbing his eyes. He'd been driving for hours, and exhaustion weighed on him like a heavy blanket. He should have found a motel hours ago, but this stretch of road had been barren. He glanced toward the young woman at the counter. She was still stirring her soup, the motion mechanical and endless. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her hair hung limply around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked before he could stop himself. The woman didn't answer, didn't even look at him. She just kept stirring, her spoon scraping the bowl in slow, deliberate circles. James frowned, but let it go. He looked toward the older man in the back. The man hadn't moved since James arrived, his gaze fixed on the swirling contents of his coffee cup. "Here you go," the waitress said, startling him. She placed his plate on the table and refilled his water glass without another word. James picked up his burger, but as he took the first bite, he noticed something. The fries were arranged on the plate in a strange pattern, an almost deliberate spiral. He blinked, wondering if he was just tired, but the more he stared, the more he felt certain it wasn't random. The lights above flickered again, this time longer than before. Storm must be messing with the power, he muttered to himself, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. The waitress appeared again, standing too close to his table this time. "Everything all right?" she asked, her tone too cheerful. James hesitated. "Yeah, fine, just tired." Her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Long night, huh?" He nodded, avoiding her gaze. She lingered a moment longer before retreating behind the counter. James took another bite of his burger, but something about it tasted off. The meat was too soft, almost spongy, and there was a faint metallic tang that made his stomach turn. He set it down, pushing the plate away. The young woman at the counter was still stirring her soup. The older man hadn't moved an inch. And then James noticed something that made his blood run cold. The jukebox in the corner was on now, though no one had touched it. A soft, scratchy tune played, the melody faint but unsettling. He turned back to the waitress. "Hey, do you guys have a phone I can use? My cell's dead." The waitress didn't answer. She was staring at him now, her head tilted slightly to one side, her smile frozen in place. James stood, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. "Hello?" he said, his voice louder. The waitress took a step forward, her movements stiff and unnatural. "No phone," she said, her voice flat now, the lilting cheerfulness gone. James's pulse quickened. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, but stopped when he saw the older man was now standing in the middle of the diner, his face obscured by the shadows. The young woman at the counter stopped stirring her soup. Slowly, she turned to look at James, her eyes dark and lifeless. "What the hell is going on?" James muttered, backing toward the exit. The older man stepped closer, and as the flickering light hit his face, James gasped. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and translucent like wax. James bolted for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. He yanked on it, his palms slick with sweat. "You can't leave," the waitress said softly, her voice echoing in the suddenly cavernous diner. James spun around. The three figures were standing together now, their faces blank, their eyes black pits. "Why are you doing this?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The jukebox's music grew louder, distorted and warped, as the figures began to advance. James pressed himself against the door, his mind racing. He reached into his pocket for his truck keys, but they weren't there. "You belong here now," the waitress said, her voice overlapping itself, as if two people were speaking at once. James's vision blurred as the lights above flickered wildly. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and the walls of the diner seemed to close in. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the young woman's pale hand reaching for his face. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The drive through the mountains had always been Emily's favorite part of visiting her family's cabin. The winding roads, the dense forest, and the crisp air gave her a sense of peace. This time, however, something felt different. The silence in the woods seemed oppressive, the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. Emily glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was 10:47 p.m., later than she had planned to arrive. She'd been delayed by work, and now the thought of driving these dark, narrow roads alone made her uneasy. As she rounded a sharp curve, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Emily gasped and slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, and her heart pounded as she stared at the figure ahead. It was a man, dressed in a tattered coat, his face obscured by the hood. He didn't move, didn't flinch, even as her headlights bathed him in light. Emily rolled down her window slightly. "Are you okay?" she called, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised his arm and pointed to the side of the road, where a narrow, overgrown trail led into the forest. A chill ran down Emily's spine. "Look, I don't know what you want, but I need to get going," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man remained silent, his arms still outstretched. "Forget this," she muttered, rolling up the window and pressing the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, and she swerved around the man, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. He was gone. Emily's stomach churned. She hadn't seen him step off the road. He had simply vanished. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light or her imagination playing games. The road grew narrower, the trees on either side pressing closer. She felt as though the forest were swallowing her whole. Then her car began to sputter. "No, no, no," Emily whispered, her knuckles tightening on the wheel. The engine coughed and died, and the car rolled to a stop. She tried the ignition again, but it only clicked. The dashboard lights flickered before going out entirely, plunging her into darkness. "Great," she muttered, reaching for her phone. She groaned when she saw there was no signal. Emily sat in the silence, her breath shallow. She debated whether to stay in the car or try to walk back to the last gas station she had passed, nearly an hour ago. As she weighed her options, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the roof of the car. Her chest tightened. She froze, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. Emily exhaled shakily, her heart racing. She reached for the door handle, like deciding it was better to risk the dark forest than stay trapped inside. As soon as she stepped out, she regretted it. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the forest itself were watching her. She looked up at the roof of the car. It was empty. A crackling sound came from the trees to her left. Emily spun around, her flashlight in hand, but the beam revealed nothing. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The crackling turned into a low, guttural growl. Emily backed toward the car, her flashlight shaking in her hand. A pair of eyes gleamed in the darkness. large, reflective, and too high off the ground to belong to any animal she knew. The growl deepened, and the thing stepped closer, just enough for her to make out its shape. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over sharp bones, and its face, if it could be called that, was featureless except for those glowing eyes. Emily stumbled, her back hitting the car. The creature tilted its head as though curious, and then it lunged. She screamed, ducking just in time to avoid its grasp. Without thinking, she ran into the forest, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her. Branches clawed at her face and clothes, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. Behind her, she could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing louder. Emily's lungs burned and her legs ached, but she didn't dare stop. She spotted a faint light ahead, a cabin, its windows glowing softly in the darkness. She sprinted toward it, pounding on the door as she reached it. "Help, please, let me in." The door creaked open and an older man peered out. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in. "There's something out there," Emily gasped, collapsing onto a chair. It chased me." The man frowned, locking the door and drawing the curtains. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said grimly. Emily looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "They don't like it when you stop," he said, his voice low. A loud thud shook the cabin and Emily's blood ran cold. "It followed you," the man said, his face pale. The thudding grew louder, more violent. The walls seemed to tremble with each hit. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. The man didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a shotgun from the corner of the room and loaded it with trembling hands. The door splintered and the thing burst inside. Emily screamed as the man fired, the blast deafening in the small space. The creature recoiled but didn't fall. Instead, it let out an ear-piercing screech that made Emily's vision blur. The man fired again, and the creature lunged at him. Emily scrambled for the back door, her only thought to escape. She flung it open and ran into the night, the sound of the struggle fading behind her. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, where a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. The car slowed as it reached her, and the driver, a middle-aged woman, rolled down her window. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her face filled with concern. Emily nodded shakily. "Please, just get me out of here." The woman opened the passenger door and Emily climbed in. As they drove away, Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind them was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her from the shadows. Story the end.